Wonderful to see you all here. I'm Ricky Gard-Diamond. I'm going to be your welcomer today. I'm going to ask us to start by, first of all, I think I'm going to just point out that we have some wonderful, wonderful experts meeting with you tonight. And the leader of that conversation will be Jules Salinas, whom I guess you can see her. Yeah, thank you, Jules. And we'll be joined by Niaz Dori, who is, you want to just wave your hand here? We'll hear more from them in a minute. And the Janice St. Ange, who is with Flexible Capital Fund, is going to be talking with us also, informing us. I'm going to just ask us to do a quick icebreaker and invite you to tell us who you are and where you're from in our chat. And at the same time, I'm going to invite you in that chat to grade yourself on let's say, a 1 to 10 score on your knowledge of the food systems we'll be talking about tonight. So we'll have some idea of who our audience is and how we should approach this conversation. There's no shame in giving yourself a 0. We're all here to learn together, and even our panelists are going to learn new things from this conversation tonight. So let's do a quick chat. I'll give you maybe 10 seconds, your name, where you're from, and how you rate yourself in knowledge about our food system and why your grocery bills are so high. Okay. Well, I don't see how I can see the chat. I guess I do see it here. Yes. I'm not a Zoom maestro, but I'm trying to be. Okay. Oh, I can see everyone. Here's Carmen Rios and Becky Hughes from New Jersey and Cherry Jacobs Pruitt. And there's Janice St. Ange and Niaz, Beth Whiting from Vermont. Hello. Mary Sanderson from Wisconsin. Great to see you. Matthew Hoffman, I'm glad you could make it from Dummerston. Hi and hello. Mary Beth Gardam from Iowa City, Iowa. Great. Joe McCord to everyone. Piano. Oh, let's see. I'm trying to see where she's from. Plano, Texas. Is that right, Jill? I hope so.
Yep,
Uh,
that's right.
oh, good. Caitlin Waddick from Vermont Real Estate Cooperative. Hi, Caitlin. I haven't seen you for a while. It's good to see you tonight. Nicole Vitello, Equal Exchange. She's an organic farmer. Wow. Glad you're here. Esme Cole from Hartford, Vermont. You're one of our legislators. Welcome, Esme. Fernando Lugo. Oh, all the way from San Antonio. Hi, great to see you. Alliance for Just Money. We need you here. And Cami Hufflin, Henniker, New Hampshire. About a 5 to 7. All right. So this is going to be a pretty wonky group. Nancy Price, she's rating herself 5 to 7 also. So the overall rating on people's ability, we're all over the place, I guess. I'm going to put myself at probably a 5.5, maybe. Okay, so I want to thank you. I think that's really interesting. Glad you're all here. And I know you're here uh, not to talk about me, but to talk about Jules, who's the executive director of WFAN, a great organization, Women, Food, and Agriculture Network. And she's going to lead our talk. And Niaz Dori, whom I told you was from um, the two organizations, the National Family Farm Coalition, great organization, and the North American Marine Alliance and um,
That's
Also,
it. No other and. Just two.
well, no, this year you were awarded the James Beard
Uh,
Award for fighting the corporatization of food at both of these organizations. And it is pretty amazing that you're involved with both of these organizations. We'll talk more about that. And Janice St. Ange, who's with the Flexible Capital Fund, and actually the founder of the Flexible Capital Fund here in Vermont, and a founder as well of the Northern New England Women's Investment Network, with a long history in working with food networks here in our state and in New England. You're going to learn more about them in our all these organizations and our resources for further learning document that I hope you all received. You should have received it. If not, we'll make sure that you get it as in our follow up with a recording of tonight's event. Uh, to be clear, I want you to know this isn't going to be a economic lecture. It's going to be a lively conversation in everyday language. And we're recording this so we can distribute it through you to a wider audience because we all know the issues we're going to be talking about tonight aren't going to be fixed tonight or anytime soon. It's going to be a longer conversation involving states and the federal government and all the players, farmers, and so on. So, an economy of our own, just so you know, is an alliance of feminist economic activists and writers who know that economics, like politics, is personal. And we want you to be able to claim your own personal economic story wherever that takes you. And we want you to claim it in a realm where money still pretty much talks in a male voice. So, Carmen, I wonder if you'd show the first slide of our intention to grow your economic confidence in your life waging value. We honor all 5 stages of women's ways of knowing, and you don't have to be a woman to know these things. You start out in silence, feeling quiet and maybe kind of dumb and disconnected. You go on to listen to voices of others in authority, and we certainly have those voices here tonight. We have subjective knowledge where we're beginning to hear our own inner voice and we might be a little fearful about it and want to be protective of it. But ideally, we're going to move on to respecting differences in procedural knowledge, interested in how other perspectives have been formed. And we ask questions and find some truths more reliable than others. And finally, constructed knowledge is that stage where we can see that all knowledge is built, not just ours, but all knowledge is built, not born, and we trust ourselves to collaborate, holding and remodeling our ideas with passion and pleasure. That's where change can actually happen. Our assumptions are that money still pretty much talks in a male voice, and they're privileged rich men who still omit or discount things that are considered female. Women have always worked, but we are underpaid in job market still, and we're unpaid still at home. All that caring work at home, whoever does it, is unpaid here in the United States. Slavery has ended, but systemic racial exploitation remains. Diverse people now own and manage businesses, but their caring and yours still doesn't count in the GDP, only money counts. Greek oikonomics, oikonomia means home management, which enables us all to claim waging life, not the war that is the system that we see working now. Growing inequality, wrecking the planet and people with an economy waged as wars tells us we can't afford more alpha male only business as usual. I think we've got more than enough billionaires. Okay, so thanks, Jules, for taking the lead on this conversation. Uh, Go for it. Thank you so much for taking the lead.
Thank you, Ricky. I had not seen those 5 ways of knowing, but that resonated for me. I was like, okay, I'm somewhere between 4 and 5 on a lot of my ways of knowing. So I really appreciated seeing that, and I love being part of this movement and enabling us to learn together. I'm really grateful for my brilliant colleagues, Niaz and Janice. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm excited to have this conversation. So I'm going to start in the economy of our own tradition by each sharing a personal story. So I believe stories have power. It's a part of our WFAN values. And so of how each of us came to care and worry about our food system. And how did you discover the passion that motivates you to work so hard to make this difference and make a difference? What keeps you going? And I'll take the lead here and I'll start with mine. I could choose from a number of different stories, but sort of I think one of my origin stories certainly started, and some of you know this. 30 years ago, I served in the United States Peace Corps in Paraguay. I was this little village, about 30 miles, maybe 50 miles, depending on how you drove it, from the Brazil border. And I was actually a public health worker. I was primarily focused on women's health, and I did a lot of work with women and children, predominantly. I ran the health post. And one night I'm tucked in my bed. I've got my mosquito net on. It's about midnight, and it's pounding on my door. And it was an agricultural village, as most places are in Paraguay. Agriculture is the main economy in Paraguay. And at this time in Paraguay, you have to understand that like there was an expression that nobody will ever go hungry in Paraguay, because Paraguay had a very diverse agriculture. There was specialty crops. Everybody knew how to feed their families, feed their communities, feed the country. There was never a challenge feeding the country. Anyway, back to my story. I'm tucked in my bed. It's midnight. I'm dead asleep, and I had this pounding on my door. Normally, when you wake somebody up or you go to somebody's door, you clap outside. But they were not taking any chances that I wouldn't hear the clapping. They pounded on my door. And I opened up my door, and my neighbor, and I say neighbor, but they lived about a mile down the street, because every house was about a mile apart, was there, and they had their 4-year-old in their arms, and she was limp, and she was like foaming at the mouth. And I said, ¿Qué pasó? ¿Qué pasó? She said, ella pensó que era azúcar. She thought it was sugar. I said, what did she think was sugar? She said, she thought it was sugar. And I said, what happened? She said, she took her finger on the table and she went like this, and she put it in her mouth. And I said, what was it? And it said, it was veneno was poison. Mm. And I said, what do you mean it was? Why did you have poison that looks like sugar on your table? No supimos, we didn't know. So it turns out that they had just for the first time ever started using pesticide on their fields, on their crops. There was no labeling, there was no training, it was not well packaged. It was just this sack that looked very much like the sugar sacks. And so they had just thrown it in the same area where they kept the sugar sacks, and the thing was open, and it had just kind of sprayed on the same table where the sugar was. And so the 4-year-old had done this in the middle of the night, and they didn't know until she started like seizing, like shaking, and that. So I saddled my horse. I had a horse. I didn't have a bike. I didn't have a car. I didn't have a motorcycle. Saddled my horse, put her and her father on the horse, walked the horse the 10 miles out to the health post, and waited until we could wake the doctor up. And he said, all we can do is wait. We pumped her stomach, flushed her out with water, gave her IVs. And thankfully, she made it. She did survive. She survived the night. And I was furious with, everybody, not the family, because they didn't know better, but I was furious with my country because that's where they got it from. I was furious to learn later that that the pesticide that they were using was illegal in my country. I was furious with just the systems. And that was really the first inkling that I got of, oh, this goes much deeper than anything that I ever knew about agriculture. And so and then that's really like the first, thing that sparked it for me. That one of many stories. The other part of that story is that expression that nobody in Paraguay will ever go hungry is no longer true, because what used to be true of Paraguay being a very diversified crops and being able to feed itself has changed, because now they do monocropping, and everywhere you look, that where this used to be this wide range of diversified crops is just a sea of soy, GMO soy that is supported with sugar looking pesticides and herbicides. And so I wish I had a happier story of how I got into agriculture, but that is the spark that keeps me going. And I think about that child being carried on her father's lap on that horse for 10 miles, and know that that's what I got to do. I got to keep working at this. So, yes, tell me a story about how you got into it. When did your passion for food justice begin?
I don't know, Jules. Well, it's nice to be with all of you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. My story has maybe, particularly around food-related issues, probably has two touch points. As a sort of a late teens, early 20s activist wannabe in California, and stumbling upon the United Farm Workers grape boycotts. That was probably my first interaction with something that has to do with food from an activism standpoint. And then I didn't have anything else to do with food-related issues till 30 years ago. That was, I don't remember what year that was, but a little bit over 30 years ago, I was working at Greenpeace as an environmental justice organizer, working on toxics issues, 1995. No, before that. Yeah, the great boycott stuff was in, I would say, mid-'80s, late 80s, in that time period. But it was 1992, 1993, I was in DC working with Greenpeace on environmental justice issues. And we, in the toxics campaign within Greenpeace, we used the community organizing approach to our work. And I had just come from living in the Ohio River Valley, working with the community of East Liverpool, Ohio, fighting the world's largest toxic waste incinerator and a lot of kind of toxic industries. And the organization asked if I would consider switching campaigns to work on fisheries issues and take the community organizing approach to the oceans campaign, of which I knew nothing. Frankly, a vegetarian, I didn't even know what the fish looked like. And all I knew really about the fisheries work was save the whales, which nothing wrong with it, but I just couldn't wrap my head around it, because I literally, you talk about the seeing the young girl on your horseback, young girl, right? And I remember when I was in East Liverpool, one day we were walking down the street with a mother and her young son, who just suddenly kind of collapsed to the ground. This is a already polluted area. And it's like, what's wrong? I said, it's not enough air for me today. He had asthma. And so I thought, okay, I can't go from there to save the whales unless I can just somehow make it, make the dots connect in my head. And so I started to be given a bunch of stories to read about fisheries issues. And as I started to read further, I realized how little I knew and how ignorant I was about the topics around our seafood system, and even the Save the Whales, which I thought I knew everything about. And then it started to dawn on me. Sorry, my dog is joining the conversation here. Just want to point out, if you see my hand over here, I'm petting the big dog. And I started to realize that the oceans fight was really not that different than the incinerator fight. It was another battle against global movement of capital. And in East Liverpool, Ohio, the air and the water and the primarily poor and low income and African-American community was in the way. And on the ocean side, the fishing communities and the whale and the fish were in the way. And it just suddenly dawned on me, this is way beyond the whale. And I could actually wrap my head around what it would look like to organize around these issues. And so I started to read a little bit more to decide where I would move if I were to work on fisheries, and DC wasn't going to be it as a community organizer. And I started to read about this town where I live now, and decided that historically, culturally, economically, it felt like the place to move to. And I called up a friend of mine from Boston and said, I'm doing it. I'm switching campaigns and I'm moving to Gloucester. And he said, you first got to learn how to pronounce the name. So here I am 30 years later. I live in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and began working with fishing communities. And I started to learn about the seaside of our food system, or the only part of our food system that has the word food in it. But when I started to look at it or think about it, what immediately I connected to was the United Farm Workers work. And I started to see the same slogans, the same issues. And I started to really think about fisheries in the context of the family farm movement. And the only part of it that I knew about was the farm workers at the time. But then I started to see it. I knew about Farm Aid. And I thought, oh, we need to do our own thing to raise awareness about family fishermen. And I was calling it in my head fish stock. We need to organize fish stock. And from there, it just built on. And years later, after I left Greenpeace, I continued working on fisheries issues. I realized that it was something I was called to do because all of the elements of it was coming relatively easily to me. And when I stepped into my role at the North American Marine Alliance, the first thing we did was to join the National Family Farm Coalition, because we thought that the community-based fishermen had a lot to learn from family farmers and their struggle over the decades. And there was not only things to learn from the not so good, but also the opportunities that were there that we could tap into. And so that was in 2008, and we had been a member of NFFC ever since. I served on the board. And you mentioned, Ricky, about me being at the helm of two organizations. In 2018, we ended up into what we call a shared leadership model, where the two organizations join forces and a few of us share the responsibilities of serving the organizations in the back of the house, while the organizations each have their own staff and their strategic plan. That's how I know Jules. Jules is a member of the National Family Farm Coalition, the Women Food and Agriculture Network. And so that's my journey into the food system and the family farm movement. Right now, I feel my role is to connect the land and sea movements with each other. They have so much in common, from the soybean that's grown in South America being fed to fish and pigs held in captivity, to the companies who are trying to control and dominate both industries and everything in between. So that's how I've gotten to this point.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, yes. Janice, you come with a incredibly different perspective, right? Like you said, like Nia said, I know her from working with her. Tell us what inspired your passion for investing innovations. I hear investing, and I'm going to be honest, my first thought, oh, investing, capitalism. So tell me, how does that tie into local food systems? Like, why does it matter? How does this all connect?
Thank you, Jules. It's great to be here. And as I was listening to both your stories, I was thinking, wow, such a different journey for myself, because I'm coming at it from the perspective of capital and one of those inputs that food businesses need to actually grow. I've had a lot of different roles over my lifetime. I'm a recovering ex-banker, a former international freestyle skiing judge, an economic development specialist, an educator, and more recently a financial activist. I'm a fellow of the Just Economy Institute, which is an organization supporting financial activists who are shifting the flow of capital and power to solve social and environmental problems. But I'm also a food enthusiast. I'm not a chef. Thank goodness I have a husband who can cook. But I understand that food brings joy, and it can heal the body and the land. And it's a necessity of life. And it can really create insecurity when there's not enough of it. I really started this work when I joined an organization called the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund back in 2008. I came there as the deputy director, along with Alan Kaler, who's the executive director, a powerhouse in food systems and natural resource market sector development. And I was brought on to help with business coaching for companies in these really important sectors to Vermont, which was food and forestry and climate change solutions. And this is back in the time when nobody was really paying attention to those sectors. They're really important to our who we were as Vermonters, important to getting food on the table, our economic development. And so we did a lot of business coaching with these kinds of businesses that were trying to grow. But if you go back to 2009, 2010, remember that was the financial crisis and capital was drying up. So these really important businesses, from farm production all the way up to food manufacturing to retail and distribution, weren't able to access capital. They couldn't get traditional debt because they typically didn't have enough collateral, or they didn't have enough operating history. And they were never going to be a great candidate for what you would call what the venture capital arena. And for we didn't even have venture capital in Vermont back in the day. So they were really strapped for cash to try and grow those businesses. But they were really important to our economy. They had a really good management teams. They were providing living wage jobs to Vermonters. And so one of the things that we recognized early on in this coaching component was they needed some kind of alternative capital. So what I ended up doing, because of my background in banking, was taking on this idea that maybe we could actually provide an alternative type of capital that would be non-extractive for these businesses, that would be function like equity, where it's flexible and it didn't have to get repaid right away, but also didn't dilute ownership, was able to help those businesses grow and be successful without losing decision-making and ownership. So that's kind of when I started this work. We ended up spinning off a for-profit entity out of a nonprofit company. We raised capital from socially responsible investors who knew this work was really important. And so I've been running the Flexible Capital Fund since then. I think the other piece that really shaped my thinking around food systems was as a Just Economy Institute fellow, I spent a week at a place called Piscinas Ranch out in California that really is showing the work of regenerative agriculture and how important soil is to the farm and food system. And I will never forget this, but Sally Calhoun, who is the founder of Piscinas, said to me, or said to us as a cohort, that in 60 years, if we don't change our practices of how we treat the soil, we will lose all our topsoil. No topsoil, no farms, no food. And that struck me so to the core, that how important it is that farmers and food producers and manufacturers and distributors are taking this perspective of how do we work within the context of building a food system that's regenerative and not extractive. And so I think that's where it really, between the work of the Sustainable Jobs Fund and this idea that we need to maintain our topsoil, the fact that money speaks. I hate to say it, but it does. And it's an important component for these food system businesses to grow. So we, in the work that we're doing with the Flex Fund, are really trying to bring a very different kind of capital and approach to our investing. We invest in people, not businesses, and really trying to provide them not just financial capital, but human capital as well, and access to our networks and to connections. So I think we've really been trying to move the needle along with other mission investors to help entrepreneurs grow their business in a more sustainable way at a pace that makes sense for them in the rural areas where they operate and the communities that they support. And I think the last thing I'll say is just what continues to keep me passionate about this is the entrepreneurs, right? In my mind, it's pure bravery to start a business, and it takes pure grit to grow a business, regardless of what kind of company you have. These entrepreneurs are the ones that are starting and growing food system businesses. They're the real heroes because they're risking their financial stability and honestly often their mental health to not only grow, but to make the food we eat and doing it in a way that brings harmony to the planet, not harm. And so they give me hope. And I guess the last thing I would just leave us with, and this was another thing that struck me, that when the last tree is cut down, the last fish eaten, and the last stream poisoned, you'll realize you cannot eat money. We all know this Native American saying. So I would say my call to all of us on this Zoom meeting is we need you as investors, capital providers, philanthropists, consumers, to take a systems level perspective when you place or spend your money. Make sure you know where your money's going and put it in things that help instead of harm. Because every dollar, every purchase matters if we want a future for our children and our children's children.
Yes, I can get behind that. Absolutely. You know, it's interesting when you talk about entrepreneurs, and I don't think prior to getting WFAN that I would have seen farmers as entrepreneurs, but in every sense of the word, farmers are entrepreneurs, you know, and some of the folks
absolutely
farmers are absolutely entrepreneurs, and they're taking all the risks. They're assuming all the risks. And you know, diversified farmers in particular, and smaller scale farmers and fisher people are also taking incredible risks, and oftentimes are not able to secure financing, are not able to secure insurance. There's so many things that the smaller, you know, business person, smaller farmer, the smaller entrepreneur is not able to do that somebody who is a bigger scale corporate fisher person or corporate farmer or industrial ag person can do. Yeah, it's this conversation that nobody's having, that they're not talking about. And of course, we're not having this conversation in a vacuum. Like, we're about a month out from the election, almost exactly a month, 35 days, 34 days. And yet neither major party candidate has even highlighted fishing or farming, let alone women fishing or farmers, fishers or farmers. So in the debates and stump speeches on their websites, apart from this occasional bucolic image of some amber waves of grain and some older white man on a tractor or at the helm of a ship, and the occasional mention of your grocery bill, there's really no discussion about farming and the folks that are behind farming and food systems. So do you think that most Americans, especially women, are aware of or even thinking about food systems that produce and store and distribute and finance what we eat? And why or why not? Is it just overwhelming at this point? Does it matter? How can women learn more? How can the folks that, I mean, studies have shown that women are usually the ones in charge of the household finances. How can they make sure that the money is going in just ways? And I'll start with you, Niaz.
That's a big question. And it touches on so many things. I think you mentioned the candidates that talking about price gouging, yet not a single one pointing out who is actually gouging whom. And when we think about well, I'll give you one example. On the fisheries side, a few years ago, we had one of the fishermen. We're really focused on trying to make sure, both on the farming and fishing side, I should say, we're working on making sure the people who provide us with the basic raw ingredients, the food providers, are getting paid their cost of operation, are getting paid the cost of operation, maybe with a little bit more, so that they can also make a profit and pay for clothes and kids' college and education and insurance and all of those things. Unfortunately, most of them are not. A few years ago, we started a project called Fishing and Farming in the Red, because with all the costs associated with fishing and farming, by the time the crop is at the market or the fish is at the dock, they're already in debt. And so we were working on trying to build systems that actually paid them a fair price. On the fisheries side, our organization modeled we stole this from the ag side, the concept of community-supported fisheries, where much like community support agriculture, you pay in advance and you pick up some fish. And And as we were doing that, we started to realize the real cost of seafood and how much fishermen and women are not getting paid. One retailer called one of the fishermen up and said, hey, we want to give you your whatever you need in order for you to catch fish sustainably. And so we said, okay, great, let's count it up. And we realize there's a scheme afoot, has been for a number of years, to privatize the rights to fish. And so most independent fishermen are now having to lease the rights to fish from what we call sea lords. And so the combination of the cost of leasing fishing rights and maintenance and markets and fuel and all of that made his fish somewhere around $6 a pound if you wanted to sell it directly. Well, the market came back and said, sorry, we're just going to pay you $2.50 a pound. And the same market is who's selling the same fish for $24, $25 a pound. And they have an 18% profit margin, minimum profit margin at every point of vertical integration. Yet to the person who gives them the raw product, they're not even allowed to make their costs to break even, much rather get a little bit of a profit. And then the farmer is the same thing. You know, we hear more and more dairy farming is probably the one that's most prominent, where we're paying 4, 5, whatever for a gallon of milk. And the dairy farmer is getting paid maybe 65 cents, 75 cents for producing that gallon of milk that costs them a lot more to produce. And talk about mental health issues. You know, we had a great rise in suicide amongst dairy farmers right before the pandemic hit. And then in the midst of the pandemic, I found myself talking to the American Psychological Association to try to figure out how to walk people back from the ledge. And so the price issue becomes a number one issue, and it's the middle of the chain that's usurping the power and profit. And to the average eater, we vilify those who bring us the food, but we don't say who those people are. We don't talk about the middle of the chain. And as a result, the fault falls directly on the farmer or the fisherman or the rancher who is getting the raw product, not on those in the middle of the chain who are actually doing the damage to our economy. And so to me, it's really hard as a woman, as whatever you happen to, whatever role you have, to go to the store and keep all of that in mind. Unless you are in a place of privilege somehow, where you can absorb that information. You don't have a bunch of kids to feed, maybe holding down a couple of jobs, and maybe your car broke down and you got to take the bus to the grocery store and then here and there. What is the last thing you're going to think about is, where is my dollar going? You're really thinking about, how am I going to feed my kids and how am I going to take care of my family? So the problem has to be first and foremost called out by calling out the people who are causing the problem. And they're the ones who are keeping the profit. The extra money we're paying isn't necessarily going back to those who are putting that fish or that corn on the market. And yet we're paying the difference to those in the middle of the chain. Somehow we need to make that clearer, so the farmers and fishermen who are also in line for food assistance during times of in the winter or when the fishing grounds are closed down, they are right there trying to get food themselves because they're struggling to feed themselves, and yet we blame them for the high cost of food. So how do we get people to pay attention? I don't know if I have the answer. Honestly, it's too long of a problem to sit someone who's already in distress and have them absorb that whole chain that I just talked about. But clearly we need to break it down somehow.
Janice, you have a full view of these markets. How do we, I mean, it sounds to me, you know, having sort of laid out from point A, you know, the farmer or the fisher, all the way to the consumer and all points in between. You know, it's funny, I mentioned earlier, you know, like the point for me, you know, was my point in Paraguay, but I grew up the daughter of a grocery man, right? Like my husband, my dad was always worked for Jewel Food, like ever since I grew up. And people say, what did your dad do? He's a grocery man. He managed grocery stores. When I turned 16, the first day, literally on my 16th birthday, he handed me an application to Juul. You're going to go work for Juul. And that's what I did until I turned 18 and went to college. So I only saw the consumer end of it. But he's seen how things changed, over the last 50 years. I'm old. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if the answer is how do we reduce the middlemen? Is it, if you're supporting individuals instead of businesses or markets, investing in individuals, how do we invest in individuals to support them to be able to thrive? If we're talking about regenerative farmers or and fishermen.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. There's no easy answer here, and it's complicated because there's consumer behavior, and then there's what's actually being produced and where it's going, what markets the farmers are selling into, and clearly, for most of us on the daily basis as women, we're thinking about how to stretch that dollar to make it go farther. We're used to cheap food. It's what we've seen over the industrialization of food over decades. And so, this idea that that we have to, we have a budget that we have to keep to, but we don't really understand where our food comes from. I think the first piece of this is being aware of where our food comes from, how it's produced, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. A movie like Kiss the Ground is a good way to understand regenerative agriculture and why it's so important to us. But since the pandemic, we've seen even more inflated food prices due to supply chain challenges. Think of where it's coming from. I'm sorry about that. Where it's coming from in the East, we still are heavily reliant on California for some of our vegetables year round. There's, since the pandemic, there's been a pressure on increasing wages for food companies. So we clearly have a vulnerable food supply. It's nationalized and it's concentrated in the hands of a few large corporations. What I'm seeing in the work that I'm doing in New England is we're trying to support regionalizing our food system, getting it back to the region where we can produce more of our own food, and it goes less distance, it tastes better, it lasts longer, and and the costs are lower in terms of association with transportation. So this idea of regionalizing our food system, understanding where your food's coming from as a consumer. Now, I know that's not as easy as it sounds, but buying local or direct from our farmers through CSAs, through online, there's a number in Vermont, for example, we have a number of our farms have online delivery, and they deliver on a weekly basis. And that's a way that I know where my food is coming from. It's not as expensive as you think it would be, and now they're getting all the margin. In the work that I do, financing food manufacturers, we're focused on financing those companies that are buying local ingredients at a fair price and making sure that they're building up their local supply of ingredients. We just invested in a company down in southern Vermont that does African cuisine, and they are selling to institutions and food service companies. So they need bulk, but they're trying now to build their local supply and paying a fair price for that, as opposed to having it go, from farmer to distributor to retail to customer. So the closer you can get direct to your food, the better the margin is for the farmer producer. I think just understanding what that local dollar does and recirculating in your own community. Those are kind of some of the top things I was thinking about. And I also think, from a cultural perspective, we've also gotten away from cooking. Who cooks anymore, right? We eat a lot of processed food in general as a culture. So this idea of find more whole natural foods that versus the processed food, which is empty calories? How do we help support this idea of getting back to cooking and using whole natural food ingredients to feed your family? You know, again, in this very busy life with lots going on, it's not as easy said as done. It's easier said than done, rather. And I think that how do we change the perspective of the importance of food, not just as nutrients, but food as community, and cherished as something that we are willing to maybe pay a little bit more for, because it's going to support the farmers, that's going to support our soil, that's going to keep us in the long run in a much better, help build a much better planet.
Yep.
Can I build on that for a sec, Jules?
Absolutely.
I agree with all that was said. I think what I'm concerned, or what I'm thinking about a lot, is the concept of equity and access. And we work with a project in Rhode Island called, some of you may know, I didn't realize how many New Englanders will be around this. You're the outlier there, Jules. We have, one of our partners is African Alliance of Rhode Island. They do have a farm where they grow their own vegetables that is connected to their culture. I've got to meet them through a project that actually how I met Helen Kaler, the Food Solutions New England. It's a regional food system advocacy work. And when I was beginning to talk with Julius Kolawale from African Alliance of Rhode Island, we talked about fisheries issues and how they come from a nation of coastal people, yet there is no access to seafood to that community. But that wasn't even it. The reason they grow their own vegetables and they have their own farm is they are living in areas where nothing but unidentified food object is available to them. You know, there is really a lack of access. Some people call it a food desert. I think Karen Washington and others have been calling it food apartheid, which is where I see it happening, because the decisions are intentional. The redlining and the zip coding is all intentional. And so those of us who have the privilege of having options can choose which farm to buy from and who to order from. But those who have none of that option and their income is such that doing some of what I do with my money is privileged in many ways. I'm still in the midst of trying to figure out how to prioritize the population that is redlined from getting good food, from getting food that is more than a box in the freezer of the bodega. That problem is, I'm not sure to what extent we can solve it, unless we can solve it with knowing where our food comes from, because even if they know where their food comes from, it's still not within their reach. And how do we solve that problem so that when they do go somewhere to buy food, they actually have options, as opposed to, this is what you get and this is the price. And if you want something better, you either have to spend a week's worth of income on it or you don't eat it. How do you spread equity across all the people who have to eat?
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. A lot of the points I was making were for people who have privilege, who have the ability to pay, right? I think one of the biggest pieces of the work that's happening in New England is the support of communities who are food insecure. And a lot of states, from what I can see, are starting to think about this and step up and create. For example, in Vermont, we have the Vermont Food Security Roadmap, and end hunger by 2030 in Massachusetts. And you talked about efforts in Rhode Island. It's going to take policy, it's going to take capital and investment. You know, it's this public-private partnership to help everyone. Everyone has a right to good, healthy food. And so how do we make that a part of our culture and understanding that our policy, our capital, our efforts need to go into supporting that goal.
Yeah, a few years ago, we worked with the city of Boston to undo an ordinance that had been in place for, gosh, I don't know how many years, 80 years, that prohibited the sale of local seafood on public property. And especially if there was other food present. So it pretty much meant nowhere. And so you couldn't go to a farmer's market to buy seafood. And this was during Mayor Menino's reign, and he had created the Boston Office of Food Initiatives. And they began to do this project where there was a pilot project at first to have seafood available at farmers markets that turned into a permanent lifting of that ordinance. But the reason I bring that up is there was a really, to speak about policy, there was a really good feature in their RFP that they put out. If you wanted to sell seafood in a Boston farmers market, you couldn't just pick and choose which neighborhood you were going to be at. For every rich white neighborhood you were going to go to, you had to also go to an underprivileged, more economically diverse, maybe more culturally diverse neighborhood. And so you had to even it out. And that opened up the access to seafood to some of the inner city of Boston, where culturally it had been part of their heritage, the Caribbean community who would tell us, I haven't had scop since I was a kid. Oh my God, we used to eat this. This is food that feeds my DNA. And now it's back here available to us. And so to make those policy decisions intentionally, so that when we have an opportunity for marketplace, we don't just go where we think we can make a lot of money. We can also make a lot of money in those communities that have been, we've been told can't afford us. And once we go there and we realize that not only can they afford us, they actually celebrate us much more so than anywhere else. The jubilance of getting food that was part of your culture and suddenly available to you, to some of the fishermen who feel like nobody cares about their livelihoods, or a farmer, to get that kind of a reception is almost worth more than what they were getting paid for their fish or their whatever vegetables. That has a price tag that no one can count, really.
And I'll just add one quick thing, because it does remind me, I used to work for the Department of Economic Development in Vermont, and part of my role when I was there was helping with broad access to the internet, and broadband access was a big issue. It still is a bit in the rural parts of Vermont, but as a policy, as policy, the state was very clear that if you want to serve Vermont, again, same thing, that you talked about, you cannot just pick and choose Burlington and Bennington. You need to cover the entire state, whether you are going to be profitable there or not. We are requiring you to put in broadband access to all communities, 100% of communities, regardless of their ability to support in that particular region. So, and we did it, and we are much better for it. And it's helped the economy. So I think there's this long-term perspective of, we're not thinking long enough term about how this is going to benefit not just the immediate community, but overall the economy of the region.
That's right. That's a good story to hear.
And that's a perfect segue that I wanted to talk about. Today is September 30th. Today is the day that the extension for the 2018 Farm Bill should have been approved and moved forward. It's not happening. It did not happen. So that's allowed to expire today. Should have been approved months ago. Hasn't been. And the Farm Bill, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's this huge, wonky omnibus bill. It's concerned with land use, forestry, nutrition programs like SNAP, which is this for actually I should know the acronym. Supplemental nutrition
and something.
Assistance program.
Assistance program. Thank you. Yes, assistance program, sometimes known as food stamps, because it used to be that, and school lunches, conservation, and climate. But you don't even hear about it. You didn't even make the news cycle tonight, which is just mind-boggling to me. So NIAS and Economy of Our Own and WFAM, we're all 501c3s. So we can't talk about specifics. We're not endorsing anybody, candidates or parties or anything, but what do you think is the most critical aspect of the Farm Bill? Like, what are the things that people should be thinking about as they go to the polls and consider their candidates' views on the Farm Bill? What's important? Why should people care about policy?
A policy takes many forms, and Farm Bill is one form. I think we heard about institutional purchasing. That's policy, changing policy at institutional purchasing level, changing ordinances in the city of Boston. They're all levels of policy. This happens to be a federal policy, and if we eat, we need to care about it. And I think most of us do. And so there are so many elements of it. And I think what's held it up more than anything else, this goes back to the issue of equity, has been access to programs such as SNAP that has been highly contested by some parts of the some members of Congress. And I'm learning every day how many things are within the Farm Bill. And the package is immense. You talk about omnibus. I think that's an understatement in some ways, even from, as you mentioned, from access to land to access to markets, to fair prices and credit access for food providers. All of those elements are now being held up. So we want to give people access to capital through federal programs such as local access, what is it, LAMP, what does it stand for? And brand new bill that just passed around local foods and on-farm slaughter. That is some of the most important things that our members in rural Vermont and NOFA Vermont have been asking for. Now, not going to go anywhere, at least not during this cycle. The good part, the good news, if there is good news here, is that we did get some what's known as marker bills, piece of legislation that put a stick in the sand, so to speak. You know, the local access piece of legislation I would just mention. Fair Credit for Farmers Act is one of those other marker bills. Access to land for farmers, especially those who have been underrepresented and not getting access before. There's been a bunch of marker bills that now means that when the new Congress takes their seat, we have just a smidgen less work to do than we did before. It doesn't mean we have no work to do. We have to find champions. We don't know who's going to keep their seat and who's going to be elected new. So we have to get new co-sponsors and we have to get champions for those bills, but at least they're in the hopper, if you will. In early March, usually for those of you who work with Congress, you know this, but for those who don't, usually after the new set of people take their seats, they ask the chairs of the new committees, you got something new that you want to bring up that we can consider for the Farm Bill. One of those issues for us is going to be fair prices for food providers, starting with dairy farmers. It's the Milk from Family Dairies Act, which we couldn't get a champion for this time around. Maybe we will next time, especially in places like Vermont, where dairy farming has been jeopardized with a lot of the consolidation that's happened. And so we're not getting the Farm Bill. My guess is, my hope is that we'll at least get some of the basic programs funded before this Congress goes completely to bed, although that bedtime is beginning and ticking as we speak. And what happens, as you mentioned, Jules, when we were warming up here during the lame duck session is unknown. We really won't know what to do for another month probably or so. But somebody mentioned, I forget who amongst us here was, the concept of hope, which is what I'm hanging on to here, that we're not only going to get something that's going to keep people fed for the short term, but also set us up for bringing the Farm Bill and all those marker bills back once Congress takes its seat after January 21st. Don't have another option, but hope in this case.
Janice, any thoughts on policy, whether it be the Farm Bill or anything that's come up or been introduced recently that you're excited about or worried about?
Well, I'm certainly not well versed in the way that you both are on the Farm Bill, but I go back to this idea of supporting local food and re-regionalizing our food system and getting away from subsidizing industrial farming, because for all of the reasons we talked about in terms of food security and healthy food and healthy soil, amp that up to let's talk about climate change, because food and how we farm can really be a mitigant to climate change, or it can exacerbate it. And so how are we looking at, I mean, I don't know enough about the Farm Bill to know if there's specific language related to climate change, but it is one of the most pressing challenges we're facing. And the low-income populations are the ones that are suffering the most from climate change, and will continue to do that, not just from weather events, but from food events. So my hope would be that, in addition to the work that's already being done, for example, with this New England Feeding New England network that's launched between the six New England states and working in concert to collaborate and build a healthy food system, getting 30% of our food produced and then consumed by 2030 in New England. Let's champion those types of efforts around the country to bring back the food to the people who to the region that it's being grown in.
Yeah, unfortunately, in terms of climate change, the only kind of policies that we've seen in that are directly supposed to have something to do with it are the concept of carbon credits, and which is another kind of pollution trading scheme, if you ask me. But for us, some of these marker bills, the package of these different pieces of legislation that we've been advocating for are meant to support the small and mid-scale diversified part of the farming and fishing sector, which for us translates into a more resilient, climate-friendly, all around ecologically sound, community-friendly, economically sound farming and fishing and food system. So we may not have the words climate in Fair Credit for Farmers Act, for example, but we know that if the small and mid-scale diversified farmer is getting access to credit so they can actually stay afloat and have a farm that is producing seasonally and variety of vegetables and livestock, so that some of that soil is taken care of by all those ruminants, we know that that translates into a climate-friendly farm. And the more of those we have, and less of the monoculture industrial farms we have, who are getting most of the subsidies and most of the credit and most of the political favors right now, the better we are inching our way towards that climate-friendly food producing system that we're looking for. We just need those champions to take the farmers' lead. The policies we've been advocating for weren't written by us, they were advocated for by our members. So something that we need to learn from those who are actually working the land and the sea and follow their lead in this case. And those policies do that.
Just this last weekend, I was trying to find it in my notes. There was a great bill that was introduced by a woman legislator, as well as, I believe it was Cory Booker and somebody else. It's legislation to help support farmers to move from CAFOs, which are concentrated agricultural feedlots, to becoming just what you're talking about, more diversified and smaller scale, and to basically become more regenerative ranching, frankly, and which is better for the animals. It's supported by over 100 organizations, including WFAN. And one of the reasons that we were behind it is because it's values based for us, but it was women put it forward. It was I wish I remember. She had 4 great tenets to her whole approach to legislation, and one of them is definitely food that is good for the body, good for the community, that it's fresh food, that it feeds the mind and the body, and it's all about our approach. It's just like, this is an amazing woman who is putting this forward. I want to say she was out of North Carolina, but I'll double check. But regardless, look it up. It's I'll find the name and I'll put it in the chat. But it brings us to our last conversation. We've only recently had women legislators that have started to shape the Farm Bill, and not only nor did the USDA census even count women as farmers for most of our history. Today, even farm workers, many of them are women, they don't even still count as farmers by the USDA. So this is an unusual Farm Bill. This is the first time that farm workers are even being mentioned in the Farm Bill. Yet nationally, women own or co-own nearly half of the farmland in America, and that includes water rights. Somebody in the chat was saying about the water rights. Water travels to our oceans. It's getting warmer, more acidic from absorbing the carbon. And I've just recently been reading Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's newest book. She's the one who wrote All That We Can Change, All That We Can Save. She's just wrote a book called What If We Get It Right? So I'm going to put this on the table. In the next 20 years, nearly 400 million acres of land ownership will transition. And really quick, what is one thing? If you, I know that this is an impossible question, but if you can just one thing, if you could get it right, what's your best case scenario in this, instead of being the catastrophized version of the future? Land is connected to water. Both land and water are sources of food, our living lives. Instead of a catastrophized vision of the future, what would be your best case scenario? Like, what would be a key element to the best case scenario for you?
I feel like I've talked too much. Janice, why don't you go?
Janice, you can go first.
Thanks a lot.
Sorry. The key, like this, at least one key element to, like, what do we have to do if we're going to get it right?
I don't know if anybody's heard Kev Mo's song, Put the Woman in Charge. That's it. I honestly, if you look at what's happening in the wealth transfer over the next 2 or 3 decades, it's going to be more than half of women will now own wealth in this country. And we know the data shows that women invest in things that matter to them, including the environment. And you can bet they're going to invest in food. And so how do we help those women be more conscious of the opportunities to invest in things that matter, that can help create a better future? I honestly think that's part of this.
Yes, I just had the pleasure of spending some time with a few colleagues from the international social movements. And one of those organizations was the World March for Women, who are advocating for a feminist economy. And they'll be holding their next gathering next year, location yet to be unknown. And it was inspiring to hear their vision and what they're thinking about. So that sort of seconds what you were saying, Janice, which is you got to put women in charge of our economy. If I were to be a little bit more, I don't know, wonky about it, I think the commodification of resources is what I would say. It's the one thing I'd like to see. I mentioned earlier the privatization of fishing rights, which means right now the right to catch fish is actually more expensive than the fish that you buy in the store. And same with land, price of land is higher than what we grow on that land. And one of the first countries that privatized the rights to fish was Iceland, following New Zealand. And it became the first country to repatriate those rights back to the people because the system didn't work. And so I'm hoping that we'll learn more and more. The concept of ownership of natural resources is a colonized notion. We didn't own land on this continent or anywhere really until the concept was introduced. So I'm hoping that we will decommodify nature. That's the one thing we need to do, whether those are fishing rights or land, and put those back in the hands of people. Everybody says, what do we have to do to feed people? Yeah, give them their land back, their seeds back, their fishing rights back, their rights to water back. People know how to feed themselves. All those basic things have been taken away and commodified. That's why they can't feed themselves. So if we can get one thing right, it's take the price tag off of nature.
I actually would second that. That is actually what, and I would agree with Mary Beth in the chat to protect the rights of nature. I've seen it happen where, you know, I am 100% behind like green amendments. I've seen them passed in different states. You know, some are stronger than others. But like when we can actually give rights, protect the rights of nature, you know, if corporations can be seen as people, why are we not doing that for nature? So absolutely, I think that that's going to be key, is that we to recognize the rights of nature, and that's the only way through. Until we can stop the financial, like Mary Beth said in the chat, stop the financialization of food, water, and natural resources, which is very similar to what you said. Yes. I don't know how that happens. But I'm hoping that this book is going to help be a guide, because it's giving me imagination that I lacked for a while, that I didn't think would be possible to dream, but it's definitely gives the power to dream. So. Carmen, I believe that you're up for giving us some questions from the chat that we haven't been able to monitor because we've been so deep into this conversation that haven't been able to look. Did you want to do that?
Yes, and I actually have some questions here that were submitted by folks before the event, and there were a few that I wanted to make sure we got to. And so let me just see right here.
While she does that, could I just interject a word? I love this last imaginary question, and it reminds me of something I read a while ago about our evolution as creatures who learn to be a little paranoid. In other words, to anticipate the bad things that might happen, because there were saber-toothed tigers back in the day, and it was good if you knew where they hung out and you could anticipate that. But the result is that we have this tendency toward paranoia, and this writer was suggesting that we come up with a new word for what you three just did, which is pronoia. What if we get it right? What if we can think about and envision and really make concrete our solutions for getting it right? I think we're on the right track. So I want to thank you very much for that question. And this whole conversation has been wonderful. Carmen, I'll butt out now.
No, lovely and very needed to say. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I think this question from Lucille Eckrich was interesting to me, to sort of hear from you all what role you think the monetary system is playing in impeding us from having a sustainable, affordable, and healthy food economy for all, and how monetary reform might play a role in helping us to achieve that healthier food economy. And if maybe that's something that's come up in your work.
Yeah, can I start?
Absolutely.
One of the things that I actually made a note of, honestly, our financial system is broken. It focuses on short-term gains versus long-term rewards. It's about growth for growth's sake as opposed to sustainability. And so until we shift our mindset and understand how much is enough, like enough, at some point you have enough, you don't need more, right? That's a cultural issue that we're facing. And so one of the things we're trying to do in a very small way, but we need help, is to think differently. Like the entrepreneurs that we're investing in, these food producers, these value-added food manufacturers, they need a longer term to actually get off the ground and go and be profitable. So when we invest for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, We need investors who are going to support us to do the same, to think the same way, and not expect that they're going to get in and out in 3 to 5 years, like an angel investor or an equity investor is. We need that mindset to think longer term and be patient and be willing to be flexible, because stuff happens, like COVID. The number of food businesses we had in our portfolio during COVID who stayed in business, all of them stayed in business because we gave them the breathing room so they could pivot their business model, so they could keep the doors open and keep their employees on the payroll. Like, that didn't happen with some other investors and providers. This is about fixing a broken financial system and knowing when enough is enough.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I feel there's not just on this continent, but globally, somehow success is measured by accumulation of whatever it is, money, wealth. You're measured based on how much how much wealth, how big you are getting, as opposed to how well you're doing. I remember when I first moved to DC, a friend of mine said, be careful, people come here to do good and stick around and do well. And I feel like that's a little bit of how our whole monetary system is measured, not by doing good, but doing well. So trying to turn that on its head, it's working for some people really well, but it's not working for a lot of people in any good way at all. And so I agree with you. We need to change our definition of success. It starts from there.
I saw a TikTok the other day, and it was obviously a skit, but it was this guy that was supposedly in the bank, and he's like goes up to the teller and he's like, something's wrong with my account. It's frozen. And they said, oh, let me see, sir. I said, oh, well, we've frozen all accounts over 10 million. He said, well, how much is in the account? Said, oh, it's 10 million. Why is that important? He's like, well, we've frozen all accounts over 10 million, all personal accounts over 10 million. He's like, well, I have, I had 15 million in there. He's like, oh, and then the teller's like, and we have a winner. This person has 15 million. Stop letting, don't let everybody know that I have 15 million in my personal account. And he's like, but nobody needs 15 million. You have 10 million in your personal account. We're just like, we're stopping the wealth accumulation at this point. At 10 million, you have enough. You have enough at 10 million. And I don't know that the number is 10 million, but there is some number that it's enough. And I don't know how we figured out that amount, but at some point it's enough, right? And it's just I was thinking the other day, like, there's a caloric need. The body needs enough calories to be able to sustain itself and have it life. And I don't know that our city planners are even thinking about how much does their city need calorically to be able to survive, right? When we're talking about food sustainability, is that really the calculation that they're using? Or how are they calculating what their food system and how is it sustainable? What is the actual like food scarcity or their food self-sustainability? I don't know if they're thinking about that in terms of actual human lives, or are they thinking about it only in terms of money? And we can't eat money. Yeah. So Nicole, your hand is raised.
So I had a question in terms of, I think there's been a lot of great ideas that have been put out here in terms of, CSAs and re-regionalization of our food system and otherwise, but it seems like there is sort of a class and wealth gap even in those, like community, like think of like your local food co-op, right? Like there was when these things started, I think there was a real issue, right? You couldn't get natural foods. You didn't have access to, like, these things weren't in every store or Walmart or wherever, right? So there was a real need to connect farms and food through local businesses and natural foods, right? And I'm saying like 20 years ago when the natural foods movement was starting, right? And it seems like it's changed into something else over time. But if, like, I mean, as a farmer, a former farmer, like I always had product that was going through different, like my CSA was not cheap and inexpensive. Like it was pretty expensive, right? Because people could pay that in advance, and that was a certain group. The farmers market was pretty expensive. Restaurants was a different product, but like I always had some product that could have gone through a different channel, right? You're hearing about fishermen who have scup and other fish that aren't tuna, and high-end items that are going overseas or wherever else. So like it feels like we do like the middle of this, which is often important, distribution or retail channels or whatever, but like if you took away some of the middle and tried to link people together, and who is probably doing this best are the sub economies of new immigrant populations and whatever. It is amazing what people can do with a small amount of resources with community capital. Like none of these things are revolutionary or we've never done before. We've just lost sight of some of them. And so I guess that's where my hope lies, is like, as the necessity becomes more and more, can we re-engineer some of these systems to, as we're talking about, connect people more locally, but with really a mind towards a lowering of the prices of food in a way that's real, that's not like private label at Walmart, but is actually like a way to say, can we support, and some of you have talked about this in various ways, but are we getting closer back to that? Or is that still kind of a utopian? Is it just too expensive to do these things now that's unrealistic?
Honestly, I don't think it's too expensive. I think it's made to be unattainable through some policies that actually don't need to be there. I'll give you one example. Going back to the city of Boston, the reason that ordinance was there is because what's called inspectional services, which is essentially the Board of Health in Boston, decided that if you were going to serve people seafood, you're going to kill people. And so we thought, what fisherman do you know whose number one goal is, I'm going to kill you with what I'm going to give you? And so how do you prevent that mindset from taking hold? Somehow, some of the ways that we're talking about, that you just mentioned, are considered to going backwards. It's not how progress is measured. And so I think about it, and I think when we think about our elders, we think the wisdom of elders, yet when we talk about some of these systems, we're talking that's backwards, yet that's nothing more than the wisdom of our elders. That's how we were fed. That's how everybody was fed. That was the concept of food sovereignty. That's the concept of community and how to kind of feed people in those concentric circles. What you talked about with your farm, you have enough to feed your community. And then from there, you go to the next circle out and the next circle out. Right now, the system is we got to feed that, not even feed, we got to distribute the biggest circle first. And maybe there is some pittance left for the community that's closest to your farm. Got to reverse that calculation altogether and start with the concept of food sovereignty. And from there comes listening to the wisdom of our elders. How did we get fed before? Which farm did you go to? And those things were not expensive. They're still today not expensive. If you didn't require that fisherman to operate by the same rules that the factory fishing operation operates by, because that one is keeping fish at sea for days in a row and then bringing it back here, chances are that fish will kill you. But the fish that the guy is catching or the woman is catching that's coming home the same day they were out at sea, it's probably still as alive as it was when it was caught a couple of hours ago. The same with the raw milk versus highly pasteurized, whatever milk. Some of these regulations are more costly. I was visiting a dairy farmer a few years ago who said they wanted to build their manure lagoon area. And the USDA people came and gave them, the only thing they had was a, the plans for a dairy farm of 1,000 cows or more. They had 89 cows. It says, so you're asking us to do this at this cost for this number of cows? That's going to increase my cost, and my milk check is already below what I need to get paid. So there is some imbalance in the policies that are in place that are no longer just about food safety and keeping us from dying from bad food. It's really now being written by those who benefit from those policies to be in place, because they're the ones who are going to have access to the market, because they're the ones that are going to step up and say, hey, you know that? We can afford to pay for that. We can afford to pay for that monitoring system over there, but that little farmer over there can't. So we must be the most trustworthy source of your food. So how do we cut through all that BS and really keep the policies that do keep us safe, but don't keep the industrial food sector safe? How do we do that? It takes a little bit of critical thinking on our part as eaters, which we've kind of let go of for a while, but not just about our food, but about a lot of other things too. So how do we bring some of that back and think about some of these? Some of the costs are not necessary.
Part of that is about educating this generation behind us and helping them understand how important it is to be engaged in these conversations, and then actually to run for office so they can make change.
Mm-hmm.
Because the same people have no incentive to make change until they get voted out of office, and then they don't have a chance. So, part of this is about, helping our younger generations understand where their food comes from, because they are totally disconnected from that.
Yeah.
I am so bummed because we are at time. And this, I could go on for another hour easily.
Yeah. Yep.
But we do need to say goodnight. I have to say a huge thank you to An Economy of Our Own, to you, Ricky, for bringing this panel to light, to you, Nias, and to you, Janice, for agreeing to be on this panel and this rich conversation. I could go on all night. This is amazing. Your feminist mindset and thought and vision and wisdom, I think, yes, it's all what we need to do. And if we can even bring just a bit of the spark into the world, into our policies, into the change that we need to make in this world. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's keep women working together to shed light on how we can make our future more delicious and wiser.
So thank you for having us.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Nice to be with you all.
Yes, you'll receive a recording of the events along with the resource document soon. We are going to add to that resource document some opportunities for people to donate to farmers and folks in the Southeast who have been affected by the Hurricane Helene. Please share with your friends and organizations to widen our sensible economic knowledge and also give people the opportunity to support those in need, of which there are hundreds of thousands at this point. And I know, Carmen, you were going to put up a slide on how to stay in touch with An Economy of Our Own.
Yes, just give me 1 second.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much. And will you be putting the chat? It was a very robust chat during this conversation, and I would love it if we could capture that chat and send that out as well.
Sure. Yes, it'll be recorded too.
Great. Thank you so much. Wonderful. I hope everybody has a wonderful night. And thank you, thank you, thank you. I so appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Great. Good night.
Bye-bye.